Hello. Welcome to the Man of Clay podcast, where you'll hear me championing the truth as one who has stood on both sides of the fence. I'm not only the host of this podcast, but I'm also the author of the Man of Clay blog. You can check out all my articles by following the link in the notes section of this audio. As I mentioned before, I've been on both sides of the truth debate. Before my life was transformed by the power of God and Jesus Christ, His Son, I was controlled by the propaganda of this world. I created narratives in my mind to make me feel better about where I was and how I was living. What's more, I was surrounded by people who did the same as me. As Jesus said, I was blind, but along with the rest of the world, I was unable to see the extent of my blindness. Now, looking back, it's obvious how far I twisted reality. This podcast is all about the quest for truth. God gave us and continues to give us the truth. The world distorts that truth. It has been this way since Eve's dialogue with the serpent, and it has continued to this current moment. I feel like I've been on a journey, and God has rescued me from a place where I was wandering aimlessly without purpose. It's with that in mind that I bring you this podcast. I hope it's both entertaining and edifying to all involved. Today's podcast carries the title, The Evil Christopher Columbus and Other Historical Myths. I get this from this title of the same subject in my blog, in my blog, in my article, one of the articles in my blog. The attempt by our culture to vilify everything that represents God and our Christian heritage is one of the most predictable patterns of this world. Columbus does not stand alone, as he's smeared every year around Columbus Day on October 12th. We have, for instance, the recent 1619 project, along with endless revisionist documentaries and a new generation of history books. We see coming up now are forming a cottage industry of anti-Christian propaganda. As a result, the truth suffers. Now, history tells us how the world operates. We can go back to any point in time and we'll find men whose conscience have been seared as if by a hot iron, who propagate myths about God and His people. 3rd century Christian statesman Tertullian, writing in his Apology, describes this phenomenon. Here is what he wrote. Christians alone are forbidden to say anything in exculpation of themselves, in defense of the truth, to help the judge to a righteous decision. All that is cared about is having what the public hatred demands. Now, I particularly like that last phrase, what the public hatred demands. What is truly amazing about Tertullian's observation is that it can fit seamlessly into any period of time in human history. You know, Tertullian's quote could have appeared in someone's Facebook page, his own if he had one at the time, or in the letters to the editor's section of the, say, Topeka Capital Journal. The world and those who cling to it will never change. The good news, however, is that God never changes either. That means the truth is the truth. And try as we may, try as these men may, those who oppose God will never be able to change it. So what's their strategy? Their strategy is to twist the truth in order to turn enough people over to their cause, and in so doing, to win temporal battles that fade into the shadows before the next generation comes of age. Now, in hearing me, you may object and say, I am not twisting and distorting and hiding in the shadows like some evil demon. And that's true. Most people believe what they hear or what they've been taught. Most people are either too afraid or too loyal and faithful to argue with their professors and teachers. But there is, I am convinced, a group of people who hate God so much that they are willing to twist and distort the truth, even history, even the past, even when it means to slander a good person. And this brings us to Columbus. Okay? Like every scenario in the real world, there were villains and heroes surrounding the voyages of Columbus. There was Columbus himself. There was Bartholomew de Las Casas, who was the Martin Luther King Jr. of his time. He spent his entire life championing the rights of the indigenous people in the Americas. There was Queen Isabella, who sincerely wanted to end slavery and forbid Columbus from taking slaves. And there is Diego Mendez, who was one of Columbus's right-hand men, who saved Columbus's life on several occasions. All of these people were heroic in their actions. But then you have men like Alfonso Pinzon, the captain of the Nina. You have Francisco de Bobadilla, a political opportunist and basically a politician turned crook. And then you have Roland and his band of malcontents who were raiding villages and creating dissension, much like, say, people that were burning down Minneapolis and other cities earlier this year. But just like Roland, who accused Columbus of all the violations against human nature that he and his own men were committing, isn't that the way it is too? I mean, there really is nothing new here. Just like people today, whether you like, for instance, Donald Trump or not, people who say he's fascist are probably the closest thing to modern-day American fascists that are here among us. Right? They accuse Trump of all these horrible things. He's Adolf Hitler, and yet they turn around and murder 1 million babies a year. And not only that, they're getting ready to up the ante to where they support abortion internationally, which means from going 1 million murders a year, they're going to expand it to 10, 15 million a year. Yet they say that they compare Hitler to someone, or I'm sorry, they compared Trump to someone such as Hitler, who murdered people just out of evilness. Anyway, let me get back to where I was talking about. There's a new generation today of liars and weak-minded followers that have risen in our current time. Just like the malcontents during Columbus's life, I just mentioned Roland and his band of criminals. These modern-day slanderers have the same strategy to undermine, in the case of Columbus's day, and Roland, to undermine Columbus's authority. Why did they do that? For the same reason they try to undermine our Christian heritage today, and that is because Columbus and our Judeo-Christian form of government, or rooted in Judeo-Christian worldview form of government, stands in the way of these evil men and their lust for gold and cruelty. Just like those who deserve to be slandered. That was some of Columbus's, some of those that came across on the ships with him. They hated Columbus because he stood in the way of them abusing others. Those who twist the real history of Columbus do so because Columbus and what he symbolizes stands between us, immoral paganism, and Marxist socialism. You see, whether it's Francisca de Bobadilla and Roldan working in unison to ruin the reputation of their political enemy, Columbus, or if it's CNN, Vox.com, and our current wave of government-sanctioned history books, it's the same age-old trick of creating a lie, repeating that lie over and over again, and gaining the favor of the powers to be. Now, the following are some excerpts from my blog. Before the 1900s, the story of Columbus was nothing like it is today. He was revered as an American icon. He was part of the Christian legacy our nation was founded on. During the early 1900s, however, Marxist sentiment began to take root in our universities and among the disenfranchised youth of our inner cities. Howard Zinn is a name that you'll hear if you give enough attention. You could Google it and learn all about him very easily. Zinn was what I call a pseudo-historian. He was not interested in history. He was interested in retelling history to lie about the Christian roots and the Christian narrative that our country was based on to justify the overthrow of capitalism towards, well, what we see about to happen right now. If you think that all this was just make-believe, just stop. Turn everything off and look at what's going on around you. Socialism, Marxism, as a foothold in this country. Now, the United States House of Representatives, for instance, became so concerned, and this was back in 1938, that they formed the House Committee on Un-American Activities in 1938. And by the way, this was not McCarthy. McCarthyism, why there's even an ism, should tell you that he had powerful enemies. McCarthy wasn't even in politics in 1938. I don't even know if he was even old enough to run for office in 1938. This came out of the House. McCarthy was a senator, Senator McCarthy. He had nothing to do with the House. So both chambers eventually were so concerned with the infiltration of Marxist sympathizers in our government that they formed committees to try to flush them out. If it wasn't for the fact that there were political allies in high places like the Oval Office that worked to prevent them from actually getting to the root of all this, we may have had a chance of skirting off this danger now. But in 1950, under the leadership of Senator McCarthy, right, of Wisconsin, a separate investigation took place on the Senate floor. And his attempt at exposing the Marxist influence in our country was met with a litany of media attacks, character assassination, political roadblocks. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring this up because Howard Zinn, the FBI, well, first the FBI was also concerned over inroads made by Marxism, not just in politics, but in our universities, which is where they really took root, and today even more so. In government, Hollywood, and so forth. Howard Zinn, and this is the main figure I want you to focus on here, Howard Zinn was one of thousands that had a file containing subversive activity against the United States. That was what he was charged with. Now, and by the way, Howard Zinn, the reason he's a main character here is because Howard Zinn wrote a history book that is kind of the quintessential example of the hit job, the lies and distortion that our history classes all teach now. Okay? Now, he had been identified by one of during this time when the FBI was collecting information, that he had been identified by one informant as having bragged by attending meetings 5 days a week at the local chapter of the Communist Party USA. In Zinn's autobiography, he describes the indoctrination into Marxism. And here's what he had to say. Living in New York City as a young man in the late 1930s, early 1940s, groups of young men would gather through the streets handing out pro-communist literature. Now, I'm reading this verbatim from Howard Zinn's autobiography. Handing out pro-communist literature and engaging in political conversation. Before long, Zinn was converted. Okay. And that's from Howard Zinn's You Can't Stay Neutral in a Moving Train. Okay. The Marxist indoctrination he experienced as a young adult continued throughout his life. Right? One of the themes in his version of American history, by the way, coincidentally, was to extol the virtues of communism in his narrative, even when those comments were anachronistic. They didn't belong in history. They were in error. Even so, he spoke of, like for instance, he spoke of the Indian tribes in America as being, quote unquote, ahead of their time. Why? Because they had a socialist approach to crop sharing. Here you see Howard Zinn's Marxist bias coming out. He depicted Stalinist Russia as heroic, right? Stalin, who murdered, 40 million of his own people? He was heroic. He even spoke of the communist guerrilla fighters in North Vietnam as reformers and heroes of the Marxist cause. Once again, Vietnam butchered their own people like every other Marxist regime. But Zinn, why would he let reality distort that? What he wants to really say, which is he wanted Marxism. He was committed his whole life, well, since he was a young boy, according to his own autobiography. And yet, A People's History of the United States, his history book, his influential history book, begins, by the way, the reason why Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States succeeded where many other history books did not, he got a tremendous commercial advertisement for his book remember the movie Good Will Hunting with Matt Damon? In that, there is a scene where he's talking to Robin Williams, his psychiatrist, and he says, you want a history book that'll really blow your way? He says, read Zinn's History of the United States. It just so happened that Zinn was from the same neighborhood. He was much older than Matt Damon, but he was from that same part of town, and that Damon was influenced as a high school student by that book and used the movie as an opportunity to promote it. Now, years later, here's one thing. The very beginning of the People's History of the United States begins with Columbus and his discovery of the American continent. That's where Zinn begins, okay, with Columbus. Why? Because he wanted to go after him. That was one of the main purposes of his book, his supposed history. Now, he talks about using original sources, and in reality, you're not worth your weight if you don't use original sources. But the evidence, however, shows that regardless of what Zinn claimed to be doing, all he did was plagiarize most of his narrative on the quote-unquote evil Christopher Columbus from an earlier revisionist history book, one that did not have the good fortune of having itself promoted in a major motion picture. Now, Mary Graber, and that's the book you'll see in my podcast, Mary Graber wrote an expose on Zinn. She's not the only one. A lot of people have exposed Zinn for being the phony that he is. She says this about his deception. Quote, "The truth is that Zinn's description of Columbus's first encounter with the American Indians is lifted from the book Columbus, His Enterprise, Exploding the Myth, a book for high school students that Zinn's friend and fellow anti-war activist Hans Kooning first published in 1976, page 5. The first 5 pages of Zinn's history are altered versions of his radical friend's work. Throughout his book, Zinn only credits Kooning once on page 17. But when Zinn does rely on original sources, he plays this trick. He cuts and pastes, literally cuts and pastes from the actual original text to make it appear like Columbus or whoever he's quoting is saying something totally different than what they're saying in order to impugn their character. Now, and it also distorts the events and deceives the reader. Now, one example of such an omission is found in Columbus's personal journal. That is, well, let me read it. Here's what Columbus wrote. I saw some who bore marks of wounds on their bodies. He's talking about the natives. And I made signs to them to ask how this came about. And they indicated to me that people came from other islands which were near and wished to capture them. And they defended themselves. And I believed and still believe that they come here from the mainland to take them for slaves. Okay, he's saying that he saw people who had been assaulted, had been maimed by people trying to enslave them. But what Zinn does is he quotes from before this passage and then after it and excludes this whole section I just read to you. Now, not only does he fail to inform the reader of his omission, well, I'll let Mary Graeber's book describe it to you. Zinn's next ellipsis, right, ... right, you know what an ellipsis is, between they would make fine servants and with 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want, covers for Zinn the dishonest pretense that the second statement has anything to do with the first. The two entries are from 2 days apart in Columbus's journal. Okay, so between his comments about seeing the wounds on these people and knowing that people were trying to enslave them, and the fact that he's saying they would make fine servants, which, by the way, is not the same as slaves. Okay, Columbus referred to himself as a servant to the king and queen of Spain. He referred to his sons also as servants in the court to the king and queen of Spain. But let's not let truth affect what Zinn's strategy was. Now, Zinn also emits his order to his men that they are to treat all natives they encounter with respect. Okay? He's also at odds with the secular historians who studied the subject. Carol Delaney of Stanford University explains that Columbus was fair to the natives he encountered throughout his explorations. And this is from an excellent book she wrote, Columbus and the Quest for Jerusalem. It might also be noted that Delaney is not a Christian. She's not an apologist for Christianity or our Christian roots. She sees plenty of flaws in America. She does not, under the delusion that America's perfect. But she doesn't see, and she realized that Zinn is a liar. Felipe Fernandez Armesto is a scholar in Latin American history, and he explains that Columbus was looked at by the Arawak tribe as a deliverer. Right? The Arawak people, you see, had been terrorized by the cannibalistic Carib tribes for generations. This was also a fact left out by Zinn, who chose to discredit Columbus, and by association, the capitalist system at large. Samuel Morison, another example, Samuel Morison is a Harvard professor and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. And he counters the leftist claim that Columbus was a sex trafficker. How many times have we heard this lately? That he was a sex trafficker. But not according to true historians. Here is a quote from Samuel Morison's book, Christopher Columbus Mariner, and this comes from pages 172 to 173. The Talamanca Indians wanted to trade with the Spaniards. To break down sales resistance, the Indians, now get this, the Indians sent on board 2 virgins. One was 8 years old, and the other 14 years old. Now let me just interject here. Who were the sex traffickers here? The Talamanca Indians sent 8 and 14-year-old girls for sex slaves to try to fatten the deal so they could have a treaty with the Spaniards. Okay? It was the Indians who were sex trafficking. Let me read on. Columbus had the girls fed and clothed and sent back. leaving the natives astonished at the countenance of the Spaniards. Columbus was the opposite. And this is what drives me mad, and others who know the truth, is people that speak in ignorance of simply because they read something or heard something, or in far worse case, because they know better, but they want to deceive themselves and everyone around them. So even with the evidence so obvious that the Indian tribes were the ones engaging in sex trafficking, Zinn used deception and dishonesty to defame the one moral agent in this story, Columbus. He did so in order to flip the distinction between a Christian culture and a pagan one. Once again, if you want to know the whys, I always want to know why, you will just realize the why they're doing this. Explanation is they want to discredit our previous form of government, our everything that is based on its history, anything good about it. They want to destroy and make it seem horrible so that they can say, oh, we have an alternative. We don't have to. Capitalism is evil. We need socialism. It's time for a change. The problem is it's built on a house of lies. Now, don't forget, as you finish listening to this podcast, I leave a list of references in the notes section of this audio. I encourage you to study further because I can only brush the surface here. Now, it's my conviction, once again, that the truth is important in general, not just in matters of salvation. Granted, there is a hierarchy of importance we should give to truth in its manifest forms. Salvation is more important than mathematics and science, granted. But we should see all subjects as being connected to God in some form or manner. I would encourage you to purchase a copy of The Four Voyages by Christopher Columbus. And I will just leave you with some things about the book so that you're not misled. First, you should know it is not a book in the traditional way. It's a compilation of writings. And the man who compiles all this information, he takes a lot of the writings of Columbus. He takes some of the writings of his biographer, who was his son and was on all the voyages with him. He takes quotes from letters written by Baptista de Las Casas, who was with him on the second voyage and then stayed there and spent his life speaking up for the rights of the indigenous people there, of the Indians, and spent his entire life in that. So please study further. I can't give you all the information. I can only point you in the direction you should go. And you should always go in the direction of truth. I am on a journey, okay? As you can see the picture on my screen, I am on a journey. My name is Clay. God has shaped me and molded me, I like to think, to fit His purposes. There is no greater good, no greater existence that we can live than to give our lives to Christ, to pursue the truth, and to stand as a pot formed and made by God for a noble purpose. God bless you.